Hi, my name is Morgiana Devitt, and today I'm going to be presenting to you my research throughout the past year. But before I begin, I'd like to ask you guys a question. So, how many babies do you think are being born right now? How many?
1,000.
Anyone else?
250,000.
So the real answer was 4 at that very moment when I asked that question. So if you take that math down the line, that leads to about 130 million babies being born in 1 year. So I pose that number because that is one of the estimated world populations at the year 0. So how did we get from that being one of the world populations to being the amount of babies being born in 1 year? So my presentation will begin to kind of delve into that topic of overpopulation, specifically in India, leading to one of the effects of overpopulation being urbanization, focusing on that effect on food production. So the beginning of exponential growth really began after these industrial revolutions, specifically in countries like the United States, England, and France. They had these industrial revolutions where they were able to use technology to support their society, and they had this initial population boom. So then these countries were able to transition into modern life, and after this, their population spike remained leveled, and they were able to support their birth and death rates more so equally. However, these least developed or less developed countries who never experienced a successful industrial revolution never really have the true technology to support their population and their society, so these societies have greater population numbers, and they often aren't able to support their society as much, leading to greater effects of overpopulation. So focusing specifically on India, it really in the past was labeled as a rural country. However, it's moving now more towards an urban country. So taking a step back, India is a third the size of the United States, and it is the second most populated, right underneath China. It has a very high birth rate, leading to a very large population. At 2011, the population was around 1.4 billion people, and its migration rates are continuing to increase. So in the year 2011, their migration rate to an urban scene was 31%. However, their urban population in the 1900s was around 11. So we're seeing that is continuing to grow, and it really started to spike after their independence in 1947. So looking at the Human Development Index, which is created by the United Nations to kind of assess how developed a country may be, India is ranked 134 out of 179. Now this is definitely on the low end. It is labeled less developed country. Compared to Norway, which is ranked number 1, India has a way larger population, a smaller life expectancy, and almost 8 years less of schooling, and a smaller gross national income. So we can see how India compares as a less developed country and some of the facets of life that are different compared to a modernized nation. So future projections in India, they're projected to add 572 million people to this earth by the year 2050. So we can see their population is projected to continue to climb. Developed nations as a whole, they expected to increase to urban areas of 57% to where they are now. And then developing nations as a whole are projected to add around 1.7 billion people by the year 2030, which is rapidly approaching. So we will see that soon kind of begin into place. Looking at this chart right here, it shows the past from 1950 and then future projections to 2050 of where populations will be added from the developed countries to the less and the least developed countries. So we can see these less and least developed countries are already adding large amounts of people to our world, and surpassing from where we are now, are going to continue to climb, adding so many more people to this earth compared to the modernized nations where their population levels remains level. So the other aspect of my project is I wanted to look at food production. So I chose to look at food grains, which are wheat and rice. And I found in India has the highest percentage of arable land and the second most available land to farm in total. So I found it very strange and almost alarming that the International Food Policy Research Institute deemed India's level of hunger alarming. So I said to myself, why do they have so much land to farm, but their food security is very weak? So that led me to be very knowledgeable about the overpopulation and its effects on the cities. We know that there's lots of overcrowding going on there to where the people are moving from. However, I was very interested to see what was going on to the people in those rural lands where they were leaving, whether they were farmers leaving the farm, if that was affecting the food production as their food security was very weak, leading me to research how does urbanization in India domestically affect food production rates. So in my study, I'm taking two separate pieces of information, urbanization rates in India and food production, and I'm bringing them together to try to find a correlation between the two values, leaving my methodology to follow correlation research methodology. And in my study, I'll be using databases and data mining to find these values. I used 4 large databases: the World Bank, the Indian Census, the US Census Bureau, which also contains global data as well, and the Food Security Portal, which gave numbers on food production. So I chose the time frame to analyze the data and look at that correlation as 1960 to 2011. I stopped at 2011 as that was when the most recent census was. So that was a stable year and lots of credible information led up to that point. And I started at 1960 because that is where all my sources began to align. However, I did not omit data from before and after these years if I looked at the variables separately, but when I brought them together, I only used those years. So I compared the data in 2 different ways: my population change and food production over time, and then I took those variables as I continued my research and manipulated them a little bit and used my population change as the y and that x variable, food production, to see how it was changing. So we can see Indian population growth from 1965 to 2011 is beginning to increase drastically, in 1965 being 500 million people to 2011 being 1.4 billion people, and that is continuing to increase. This rural to urban population percentage, the urban population percentage is continuing to grow. In 1901 at 11%. We can see right around 1950s, right after that Indian independence, their urbanization rates are continuing to increase. Their urban population is growing to about a 1-to-2 ratio in 2011, which is way more than we see 100 years prior. And probably the most important graph in my study, which is food population over time. So I chose to look at the wheat and the rice, year 1 being 1960 and year 51 being 2011. And I wanted to look where the dips were in both food grains to see if that could provide a staple year where this urbanization rate might have been something especially high. And then also to note there have been no notable famines in India, which would lead to both food grain production being on a decrease. And so those were the values, those dips, that I really noted into my research. So generally I concluded that food production is on a general increase along with the population, along with urban migration rates continuing to climb. So although food production is on this general increased trend, there were notable years where both wheat and rice production were on a low. Those years were 1962, 1965, 1972, 1979, 2002, and 2009. So what I concluded is correlation may be able to be determined. However, this conclusion cannot be truly definitive as I do not have enough research to support that. So what I did was take those notable years. If research were to be continued, and that would be done greatly by a government official that had access to these numbers, then they would want to look at those notable years that I found and compare them to the specific urbanization rates during those years. Because I'm a high school student, I don't really have access to the urban migration years at that rates and those specific years because of the databases that I was able to use. So this study were to be continued, it would be of great use to the Society of India for one of an official to really continue this study. So this type of study is very, very valuable, especially to a country like India. As sudden changes from a rural to urban society can disturb this equilibrium. India is right now a less developed country, and they want to continue to raise their Human Development Index score as they become more modernized, or at least try to be. So understanding how these shifts in population are affecting society is very valuable to the Indian government. And food production affects how people in that country will be able to survive and really live their life. So if food production isn't able to support the life of that growing population, then that country will not be able to continue to try and thrive.
Okay, thank you, Morgiana.
After you chose your research question, which information guided your choice of a research method?
So as I continued to narrow down my research question and I eventually chose these two different variables, I saw that there were many different ways I could take it. I could try to bring them together and form a new conclusion. However, I found that because of the gap in knowledge that I found on the internet between urbanization rates and food production, it led me to try to bring them together and find a correlation which supported my correlation research methodology.
Thank you.
Which of the various perspectives that you explored was the most difficult for you to incorporate into your research, and why?
Probably the most difficult perspective to bring into the picture was the aspect of technology as a whole and comparing it to other countries that were being modernized, as I found a lot of information on stats and statistics, but not really what was going on with why the farm rates and the food production rates were so low. But that would be because they had that failed industrial revolution compared to modernized nations which had successful industrial revolutions.
What unanticipated turns did you encounter as your research progressed? What were the reasons for this change in direction or focus, and how did you modify your method or approach?
So, can you repeat that question? Sorry.
Sure. What unanticipated turns did you encounter as your research progressed? What were the reasons for this change in focus, and how did you modify your approach?
So as I first started my research, I really only wanted to focus on overpopulation and how that was affecting society. But I realized that was way too broad a topic, and overpopulation has way many more subtopics in it. So I then started to research effects of overpopulation, which really what I first wanted to do, effects of overpopulation. But I learned one of the effects of overpopulation is shifts in society, and in India that shift was from rural to urban life. So then I decided to pinpoint that specifically and its effect on something else, which led to my specific research question.
Thank you.